I think you got to give credit where credit's deserved. Michigan beat the titan of the college football world yesterday. And I spent a big chunk of yesterday's podcast talking about how Michigan will, on a somewhat frequent basis, or at least a yearly basis, will lose a game where they beat themselves and they get arrogant in their play calling, in their attitude on the field, that they beat themselves. And for a big portion of yesterday's game, especially in the second half, it appeared as if they were going to lose, it was going to be because of self-inflicted problems. And they turned it around, and they beat the 10,000-pound gorilla on the block to get it done. I think Michigan deserves the credit because for a while, in the second half, I guess let's go back. In the first half, Michigan dominated Alabama. 13-10 was the halftime score, however. And I thought, if you feel like you dominated your opponent and you're leading by 3, that does not bode well for you in the second half. And it didn't for a while. And when you look at what would have been the reasons for why Michigan lost, had they lost, it would have been because they muffed a punt that led directly to an Alabama touchdown. They screwed up an extra point. They called a flea flicker at one of the dumbest possible times. When they had Alabama's back against the wall, they let them climb back in. You muff a punt that ends up being recovered at your own 1-yard line. It was going to be because they self-inflicted their problems and they got arrogant in situations that they should not have been arrogant in. They had Alabama's back against the wall, and all they needed to do was continue to shove the football right down their throat. And they got cute at an inopportune time, and it was going to cost them. And in old Michigan teams, that would have been the difference. They would have crumbled up, folded, not been able to have an answer, have virtually no resiliency, lose that game, and then spend the offseason talking about what might have been the one that got away, etc. But they didn't. They regrouped, reset, steadied the ship, and got a win when in years past they would not have. So I think they deserve credit for what they accomplished yesterday because it's an impressive victory, whether you think they played well or not. They absolutely they did dominate the first half of that game. I don't know how many times in the last couple of years that Nick Saban has had to take a team in the locker room and say, okay, so we took a couple of pretty heavy body shots there in that first half. We're going to have to regroup. And I don't know how many times that he's had to say, we got to figure out how we're going to protect our quarterback. Because it just generally doesn't happen all that much to Alabama. And Michigan inflicted their will defensively on them. Now, there were some halftime adjustments made to really make it a fun, interesting ball game. But when it mattered most, Michigan was the better team. And that wouldn't have been the case the last couple of years. You saw it against TCU last year. You saw it against Georgia the year before that. You've seen it in the past against Ohio State, that when push came to shove, that they crumbled. They did not crumble yesterday. And I think they deserve credit for that, especially when you're learning that lesson and proving that you've learned that lesson against the team that has defined the sport for the last 16 years. It's an impressive victory. And now I would tell you that I think I got both games wrong yesterday. I thought Texas would win. I thought Alabama would win. I didn't get one right. I was pretty close on the scores for both games, somewhat close, or at least I had them pegged as pegged Washington, Texas as a shootout. I would think that classified as a shootout, and I thought Alabama, Michigan would be a somewhat low-scoring, rock'em sock'em game, and I think both of those things happen. I think Michigan deserves a ton of credit. I think they had answers at the right moment, and they had the right answers. And I think we're going to talk about this later in the week. If Michigan took a popular coaching trend and flipped it on its head to find success, and they've earned it. But I think that's all the Rose Bowl comes down to, is Michigan was the better team in high leverage, really important situations. Now, I will say, despite all of that, if Jalen Milroe does literally anything other than what he did, it certainly appeared as if there were two options on that final play. One was it appears as if it's an RPO, right? You swing it to the back out of the backfield, who the guy tasked with guarding him is about 8 steps behind. So if Jalen Milroe catches that snap and throws it out there, if you've blocked it well, you either have 1 on none or 1 on 1. And I think you have to like your chances in that situation. The other play, it appeared as if it's the same play. The other option is it appears as if you pull the right guard to kick out the defensive end, and Jalen Milroe has a wide open hole to waltz into the end zone on a quarterback counter. And Jalen Milroe did not swing the ball out to his left and did not run a quarterback counter. He caught the snap and ran directly ahead as if it was a power, as if it was 4th and 1 from the 1-yard line. And I know that there was a quick, immediate reaction that Tommy Rees called virtually the worst possible play that you could call in that situation. I don't think he did. I think he called an option-laden play that gave them a couple of chances to be successful. You let Jalen Milroe beat you with his arm, or you have this really athletic quarterback catching a snap, running off tackle to the left on a counter where there's a pretty big hole, where you put the defender in conflict, right? The outside linebacker either stays right there and you throw it to the swing out of the backfield, the guy that's motioned out, and you probably score, or that linebacker follows the motion man and you got a wide open hole to score a touchdown. It's a pretty good play call. It just was poorly executed, and that's not the offensive coordinator's fault. I know that I know that it was a bad snap, and it's something Alabama dealt with the entire season, which I'm not 100% certain how that happens. Like, when you find out that your center has the yips, I think that, like, maybe that guy's not your center anymore, but they stuck with him through thick and thin, however that ended up turning out for them. But it appears as if Jalen Milroe made up his mind before he got the snap. This is what I am doing. And if he does either of the things he's supposed to do on that play, Alabama probably scores. So, while Michigan deserves all of that credit in the world, it still came down to them being the better team in crunch time when it mattered the most. Because I don't know that I would think that J.J. McCarthy makes that mistake. And I don't know if that comes with experience. I don't know if that comes with athleticism. I don't know what the difference is there between not making that play when you have 2 avenues to make it and making the right read, making the right decision. Michigan was the better team in crunch time. They got a win, and they're a game away from winning a national title. On the flip side, how about Washington? I saw pundits make the case that Georgia should have been in the playoff ahead of Washington, that there should have been 2 undefeated Power 5 champions left out of the college football playoff, and that after Georgia's performance against Florida State, they had proved that they were one of the 4 best teams in the country. And I don't know that that's unwarranted. Is Georgia one of the 4 best teams in the country? Probably. Maybe. potentially. If they're not one of the 4 best teams in the country, they're one of the 5 best teams in the country. And so for Washington to get that disrespect, and there's a difference between like perceived disrespect. I saw Michigan players after the game yesterday, like, you doubted us. Like, what the you were ranked number 1. you were the number 1. The committee thought you are the best team in America. So the idea, like, you've doubted us, we've had to fight through adversity, like that adversity was self-inflicted. You created your own problems. But that's neither here nor there. That's another discussion for another day. Washington got somewhat similar disrespect of throughout the college football playoff rankings. They were, for a long portion of the rankings, they were number 5. When Oregon, the team that they beat, were number 6. So it almost appeared as if the committee thought continually, we think Oregon is better than Washington, despite Washington beating Oregon. And when they play in the Pac-12 championship game, it'll sort itself out and we'll be able to put Oregon in front of Washington because we think that the Ducks are better. And all Washington just did was winning. All they did was continue to put points on the board, be really explosive offensively, be good enough defensively to continue to win games. And now, like Michigan, even though they do it in a somewhat drastically different way, when push came to shove and crunch time hit, somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. And each and every time thus far, Washington has been the one that has risen to the challenge. And I think there's something to say about that. There is something impressive to say each and every time you had to answer the bell. You did it. Now, they nearly pissed it away, nearly mismanaged the game away. And we can probably dive into that leading into the national championship game. Like, hey, the things you got to make sure you get rectified. That's one of them. But every time the bell was rung and they had to answer it, they did. And so I think this creates a really super interesting national championship game because I don't know how well Washington matches up with Michigan from an offense to defense perspective. I don't know how Washington matches up super well to Michigan defensively. I think Michigan's defense matches up somewhat well with Washington offensively. And I think you have to operate under the idea of if Michigan could get to Alabama, they're going to get to Washington. So we'll see how that pans out. We got plenty of time to talk about it. But I think you got to give credit where credit is due. I don't know how many people thought Washington was going to win that game. I don't know how many people thought Michigan was going to win that game. And they did. Because each side had an answer when they needed it most. And I realize that sounds super simple. When you watch a lot of college football, it's not that simple. Teams aren't able to just pull it out of their woohoo when it matters most sometimes. And those two teams did. And they earned their spot in the college football playoff national championship game. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. If you are listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. We'll be back at it tomorrow, talking more college football right here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.